Hey folks, I'm Allison. Welcome to my Wolf Hall reading vlog. I thought this was kind of an interesting format of review video to give you the opportunity to get my contemporaneous thoughts on the book that I'm reading as I'm reading it. Now, I will admit that I am already about 70 pages in, and the beginning sections of this book are really setting up the character of Thomas Cromwell, who the book is about. It starts when he's probably a teenager, maybe 13 or 14, and then it jumps quickly through time to his adulthood. But one of the interesting things about the section where she's really introducing the character and trying to sort of build sympathy for the character is that she's overcoming a lot of, I think, cultural bias against Thomas Cromwell. Like when I think about Thomas Cromwell, he's always the sort of creepy villain in the back of the Anne Boleyn story. So she has her work cut out for her getting the audience to be open to the idea of caring about this character and wanting to root for him in his story. And she does three different things to start ginning up that sympathy right from the jump. So I think the reason that you start with him as a young teen is he has an abusive father, a physically abusive father, and being with him even for just one chapter of growing up as a child in an abusive household immediately grips the reader and makes you sympathize with Thomas. The second thing that she does is really highlight the difference between his socioeconomic background or his class background and the background of a lot of the people that he's interacting with. You know, he is someone who grew up in relatively not impoverished circumstances, you know, but in sort of tradesman circumstances, and then was thrown out from his home and sort of sent on the road to go make his fate, and has climbed up to his successes through his own sort of effort and smarts and abilities. And that, I think, when he's often interacting with people who are of sort of upper classes and have maybe gotten to where they are without having to really work for it or having particular merit, is another way to make the reader immediately sympathize with Thomas. And then the third way that I thought was kind of interesting is they introduce quite early on his relationship to his wife, Liz. The author spends time letting you know he knew Liz, he worked for Liz's father, and he knew Liz for a while before they got married, and she is not that young, she's a widow, and basically indicating that he married her for sort of practical reasons, but at least in part because he liked her personality and not just because he thought she was hot. Which, you know, for stories about rich people in this day and age makes him, I think, to a modern reader, more relatable. So I noticed right off the bat those three tactics that she uses to try to overcome the bias against Thomas that most readers are probably coming in with. The only other thing that jumped out at me from these early chapters of the book is her dialogue bothers me slightly, the formatting of her dialogue. She keeps doing this thing where she will have a character say their line, and then there'll be a paragraph break, indent, new quotation marks, and another line of dialogue that is the same character just continuing their previous thought. And I think that is technically the correct way to do it, but it's just very confusing. It's happened several times where there hasn't been an obvious context clue from the end of the prior line of dialogue that it was going to continue to the next line of dialogue. And so I've just thought it was the next person speaking and then had to stop and go back and reread and really follow, okay, who is that? Who is that? So that is one minor thing about this book that is annoying me slightly so far. But other than that, I'm really enjoying it. It is really well written. The characters are relatable without feeling overdone. And it's also very poetically written. Like a lot of the things that are happening, she sort of suggests them rather than saying them. And that is also really, it makes it a little bit harder to follow the action, but it also makes it such a immersive, sort of lovely reading experience. So those are my thoughts from the first 70 pages. I will check back in after I've gotten a little further. Okay, I've made it through about 70 more pages, and so far I'm still really liking it. There are a couple of thoughts that I've been having as I've been reading. The first is about the time jumps. The book is set basically between the period 1500 and 1535. But most of what I've been reading, there's sort of a little bit at the beginning of his childhood, but most of what I've been reading so far is set in the 1520s. And you go from sort of his childhood and the sort of early setting up of his character and who were the key people in his life. And then you jump ahead to a short chapter set in 1529, which is when his sort of boss and benefactor, Cardinal Wolsey, basically falls out of favor with the king. And then you jump back in time to the early 1520s, and there's the sort of most of this chunk of the book, this next sort of section of the book, is marching slowly towards the 1529 date where, things start going really badly. And it gives the whole section of this book a lovely suspense, because as all these things are happening, you as the reader know, you have the context of the hindsight to be able to see how all of these little things that are happening are building towards this inevitable sort of downfall moment. And that, I think, is really well done. I think it is sort of a challenge for authors writing historical fiction to be able to build suspense when all of the events have already been spoiled. And maybe it's a little bit easier in a context where the events are not, these specific events are maybe not so familiar to readers. I always think people writing about, Anne Boleyn or the other wives of Henry VIII, for instance, that it must be very difficult to build anticipation when everybody already knows exactly how this all goes down. But she's done a really good job of making me care about following the day-to-day events, partially through interweaving Thomas's personal life and the prospects of the people in his immediate circle that we care about because we get to know them as characters, sort of weaving them through these historical events. But also, I think the way that she has sort of set up the time jumps does a good job in helping build that anticipation. Another thing that has really struck me reading this book is the way that it gives you this sense of the time period, that government is this like frail thing. The power and authority that these figures have, you think of Henry VIII as like the King of England with all of this firm, absolute power and authority to do what he wants. And, there's a degree to which that turns out to be true. But there's also a degree to which all of these characters, Thomas Cromwell particularly, is so conscious of the fact that so much of government is just like a sort of flimsy sleight of hand standing between people and just like power gained through force and violence. There's a really interesting quote here about basically the only thing that it is to have legitimate authority is just to get buy-in from people that you have it. So this is part of an internal monologue that Thomas is thinking to himself. There cannot be new things in England. There can be old things freshly presented, or new things that pretend to be old. To be trusted, new men must forge themselves an ancient pedigree, or enter into the service of ancient families. Don't try to go it alone, or they'll think you're pirates. I think it does a really good job of communicating the sense that these men, Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell, have of the extent to which government and, you know, national stability are really ideas, you know, and they can be undone like so much faster than you might think. Another thing that really struck me that this book does well is give you the sense of the pervasiveness and sort of chaotic tragedy of illness in this time. People are just dying left and right of illnesses. You know, you get to know all these characters and they have families and you get to know their families, and then they just die at the drop of the hat. And it is senseless, and it is, you know, not to do with any sort of plot or narrative device, because, you know, we're talking about like historical characters, so we're talking about their actual deaths. And also it just gives you the sense of how just pervasive illness and death were in this society. You know, we nowadays think of someone getting sick and dying as, you know, a really scary, somewhat unusual tragedy. Whereas, you know, back in this time, it was just everywhere all the time. People were just dropping dead. And it's just such a different mentality around life and mortality. And I think this book has done a really good job communicating that, what it feels like to live in that time. One thing about this book that I am curious about, though, in terms of the sort of historical accuracy of it, is Thomas's views on the women in his life. He has a very interesting relationship with his daughter, Anne, who he considers to be, she's like his favorite child, and he thinks she's like the smartest one of all of his children, and she is probably the one the most like him. And he seems to have a lot of respect for her as a person. And, you know, he also seems to have a lot of respect for the other women in his life. And I'm very curious whether that is a true feature of what Thomas Cromwell was like, you know, if the sort of historical research shows that he had that perspective, or if that is, you know, sort of one of those big question marks in history that the author, you know, that Mantel here has filled in with a sort of modern, or, you know, more modern view on women as a way to, you know, humanize this character and connect him to modern readers. That's not a question I'm gonna like answer. That's just something that I have been wondering as I've been reading these most recent chapters. Anyways, I'm gonna go back to reading some more. We have just at the end of this section that I'm reading made it back to the 1529 sort of downfall moment. And, you know, there's still a lot of book left to go, and 6 more years that the book covers, you know, to get to 1535. So I'm very curious what is going to happen in those subsequent years, and what is going to happen to Cardinal Wolsey, and, you know, if he sort of is permanently fallen out of favor, what is going to happen to Thomas in his, you know, post Cardinal Wolsey existence. I think I may go read outside for a little while. I refilled the bird feeder this morning, and I'd like to go hang out, and it's a beautiful, beautiful day, and so I think I'd like to go hang out and watch some birds while I read, but I will check back in maybe another 70 or so pages. So we're back. I am about halfway through at this point, and I took a break from reading this afternoon to make some lunch, and then I went to an art exhibition where I had a friend who was showing some pottery, and I bought this absolutely adorable little pottery man and this beautiful bowl. I am trying to do a no buy year this year and have been pretty successful so far, but the goal of the no buy year is more not to give my money to big corporations and billionaires. And so I felt like supporting my friend who's like a local artist, and one of her friends who was showing at the exhibition next in the sort of section next to her, that fell sort of in the gray area of the no buy. But anyways, I've then come back to reading for another little while, and I don't have a ton of new thoughts on this section of the book. It's interesting, the first big chunk moves pretty quickly through time. It covers almost a decade, and the last 70 pages have all been basically within the same year, 1530, because just a lot of things have been happening in that year, a lot of uncertainty that relates to Thomas's position in court and the position of Cardinal Wolsey. And it's been very interesting in terms of pacing to all of a sudden, after sort of having moved through a bunch of different events, sort of really slow down and spend such a long period of time in the individual machinations and relationships and sort of schemes that are happening in, just over the course of this 1 year. But it's been kind of fun because it has meant that we have gotten to spend a lot more time with some of the more like well-known characters in the story. So, Thomas has been spending time with Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary Boleyn and with King Henry, and it's been sort of fun to actually get to have those characters who in the sort of first part of the book were really just floating on the periphery brought into the story. It's interesting the license, that an author in historical fiction can take. There are certain aspects of the relationships between Thomas and the sort of minor characters, his household, people that there isn't a lot of historical record of, where, the author really takes, I think, some creative liberties and sort of creates relationships where maybe there weren't relationships, or, reads a lot in. But it's, then interesting to see the shift to focusing more on Thomas's relationship with these more well-known characters, where there just like are more constraints because we actually know more about, the letters that were being sent between these different people and the sort of the way that their various relationships ended up playing out. So that has been kind of a fun tonal and pacing shift in the sort of second quarter, let's say, of this book. That's really all that I've got at the moment. So I will check back in when I have gotten a little further later on tonight. Okay, I am through the end of part 5. I have about 100 pages left to go, and I don't think that I'm going to finish the book tonight. I'm running out of steam. But a couple other thoughts that I have had while reading the last little bit. The first is that I think it would be a lot easier to follow this story if I were British and had learned British history in school. There are a lot of characters in the story, like the Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Sussex, that I suspect would be a lot more familiar to British readers. And I wonder if some of the sort of complexity and difficulty that I have been having keeping track of all of the various characters is partially related to me just having a lack of familiarity with the history. That said, I think Mantel is doing a really great job and an interesting job playing with the uncertainty in the historical record and playing with the uncertainty that even the characters have about Cromwell's life, and particularly his early life. There's a running joke throughout kind of the whole book so far. It sort of keeps coming back up even in these later chapters, where Cardinal Wolsey would tell people lies, just make things up, crazy stories about what Cromwell was up to in the sort of years in his late teens, early 20s that he spent out of England. And people will periodically pop up and ask Cromwell, even years after Wolsey's dead, ask Cromwell, oh, I heard this is what you were up to, or is this story true? And Cromwell sort of can trace these back to this little practical joke kind of that Cardinal Wolsey liked to play. But it's such an interesting repeated note for her to hit, because every time one of these characters talks about one of the made up stories that Cardinal Wolsey put forward, the reader is reminded, oh, this whole thing is just a story. There isn't, fictional Thomas Cromwell in this story doesn't actually have any more real of a history than the fiction within a fiction stories that that fictional Cardinal Wolsey created. So I thought that was a very neat trick and something that I have found very funny. One other thing that jumped out at me as I was reading these later chapters that relates back to some thoughts that I was having about the early chapters. The way that the book is written is very roundabout and poetic. Often Mantel will be talking about events. Often Mantel will be talking about events that happen, and I don't even totally understand what the events are until I'm looking back on them a couple paragraphs later and the characters are reacting to them, and I'm like, oh, they're reacting this way. I realize now because that's what happened. And there's this great example that I want to read you on page 65, which is quite early in the book, and it's an interaction between Cromwell and the Cardinal. Laughing, the Cardinal pushes back his chair, and his shadow rises with him. Fire lit, it leaps. His arm darts out, his reach is long, his hand is like the hand of God. But when God closes his hand, his subject is across the room, back to the wall. The Cardinal gives ground. His shadow wavers. It wavers and comes to rest. He is still. The wall records the movement of his breath. His head inclines. In a halo of light, he seems to pause, to examine his handful of nothing. He splays his fingers, his giant firelit hand. He places it flat on his desk. It vanishes, melted into the cloth of his damask. He sits down again. His head is bowed, his face half dark. What that paragraph is describing, and I'll be curious let me know in the comments whether when you hear that, whether this is what you imagine happening. But what that paragraph is describing, as Cromwell later clarifies, is that Cardinal Wolsey is standing up and preparing to strike Cromwell. And Cromwell has jumped back against the wall to get out of the way, essentially so that the Cardinal won't hit him. And then because he's out of reach by the time the Cardinal sort of realizes what he's doing, the Cardinal then doesn't hit him and sits back down, and I think feels sort of ashamed that he was about to be physically violent with his employee. But that is not at all, the first time I read that, it really was difficult for me to parse the sort of poetry of it, to really understand the violence of the scene that it's explaining. And one thing that I have realized as more and more characters have talked to Cromwell and described Cromwell is that he has this gift of language, this very, I think, political, diplomatic, but also sort of English ability to say things without saying them, or say things without upsetting people, or, soften things in a way that makes them more palatable to the listener, particularly when the listener is someone of a much greater rank or is the king. And I think that's so interesting because it makes me think that this book is very much in Cromwell's head. You follow him throughout the narrative. You're getting his thoughts on his perspective on the various characters and his thoughts on the events and his internal musings. And my interpretation, at least, of some of this poetic, flowery language is that Cromwell is, in his own mind, as he sort of relates these events to himself, is softening them in the way that he might soften them, is using this sort of power of phrasing to say without saying things that maybe would cast Cardinal Wolsey in kind of a negative light, and Cardinal Wolsey is someone that Cromwell really likes and respects and looks up to. And so maybe he doesn't really want to say straight out, and then Cardinal Wolsey got up to strike me, and I shrunk back against the wall to get out of his reach. And so I think that I have in my mind reframed a bit the sort of the poetry, but particularly the poetry when it obscures the events, as Cromwell using this gift of, this very like diplomatic British politician ability to say things without saying them. And I don't know if that is why Mantel wrote it that way. Maybe she just also has that sort of British gift with language, and she just has a very poetic writing style. I haven't read any of her other work, so I don't have anything to compare this to. But I wouldn't be surprised if the reason sometimes the writing can be a bit difficult to penetrate is intentional, is that sometimes it is probably difficult for people who are interacting with Thomas Cromwell to really penetrate the things that he's saying. And probably he's saying things a lot of the time that are sort of going over people's heads, or he's saying something mean in a nice way and the person only later realizes, oh, he was insulting me, So that's my theory. Those were really the only new thoughts that I had reading these last couple sections, but I will let you know my full book review when I have finished. Okay, so I finished. I have a few more thoughts to share with you before I give you my full review and rating. The last 100 or so pages took me a lot longer to read than the first sort of 4/5, 5/6 of this book. The beginning of this book I found really compelling, and it sort of went a little downhill for me as the book progressed, just in terms of pacing. I think one reason for that is that the end of the book deals with events with which I am much more familiar. They have to do with the births of Anne Boleyn's baby, and with Queen Elizabeth's birth, and then Anne Boleyn's miscarriage, and the sort of beginning of the sort of souring of her relationship with King Henry. And then I think the other reason that I found it kind of slow at the end is that the last 100 pages are really marching towards the execution of Thomas More. And Thomas More is set up in this book as Thomas Cromwell's kind of main antagonist and foil. Cromwell is a reformer, a sort of Protestant reformer, and whereas Thomas More is very much a strict religious Catholic conservative. And the thing about that is that I didn't find More to be that compelling of an antagonist. I think you're supposed to be sort of balancing the fact that he is presented as kind of not that great a dude. He's mean to his wife and kids, and he burns people at the stake. And that is supposed to be maybe sort of redeemed by the fact that he's a true believer. He's not just someone who is doing these terrible things because he thinks it's the way to money and power. He refuses to bend on his religious convictions, even when he is, ultimately that means he's going to be burned at the stake. But for me, I just didn't find the virtue of that to be sufficient to outweigh all the sort of character flaws and the things that made me just not like him as a person. The problem about it was that I didn't care in the end. It wasn't like I was psyched for Thomas More to be burned at the stake. Obviously, that's a horrific death for anyone, and Cromwell, cares enough about him and is invested enough in that not happening that it's not like the book is leading you towards being psyched about that awful outcome. But also, I just found Thomas More such an unappealing character that when it came down to it, I just felt sort of apathetic. And so the last 100 pages, you're sliding towards this event, and I just felt kind of apathetic about reaching it, and that made the end of the book kind of slow. That said, I really enjoyed the book overall. I think she does a really wonderful job of bringing the time period to life and immersing you in what it felt like to live in this period. The combination of sort of disease and death and the instability in political systems, and also, the fervent religiosity. She does a really good job of weaving the social and cultural phenomena that were happening in through with the sort of political machinations and personal issues, you know? So I think she does a really good job of presenting and exploring the question of, was England's break from the Catholic Church inevitable? You know, was it something that was really to do with views about the English rulers that were becoming predominant and, you know, a desire to not be paying essentially taxes to the church? Or was the fact that Henry wanted to get divorced from Anne Boleyn really such a key driving factor that without that personal relationship, things might have gone differently? You know, I think she does a really good job exploring that question, which is an interesting one. But one thing on that point that is a criticism, I will say, in her attempt to humanize Thomas and make him a compelling protagonist for modern readers, I think she has gone a little bit too far in the direction of making him a sort of agnostic rationalist, because he, in his internal monologues and the way that he presents himself, you know, his own thoughts about all of the things that are happening, he seems to be quite removed from the religious debates. You know, he seems like someone who doesn't really care that much about the actual truth of the religion. You know, he wants people to just make practical choices that will like keep them from getting killed. But that's not really accurate, and it doesn't really line up with the actions that he takes in the book. You know, like she does a lot of historical research clearly to make sure that the actions that he's taking are being presented as he actually took those actions. And if you just look at his actions, he is actually at significant risk to himself part of this reformist Protestant movement. He is actively trying to help people get these banned books into the country, you know, these banned English language Bibles and, you know, essays and works and books and things arguing that people should be able to read the Bible for themselves and come to their own interpretation of it. He's like risking a lot to illegally import these books and facilitate their distribution to people. And that just felt very at odds. Like the actions that he takes historically felt very at odds with the way that she presents his internal monologue about religion. And I think that also comes from this tension of trying to present a historical character as the protagonist for modern readers. So, okay, what does that mean for my overall takeaways on this book? I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great example of historical fiction, but I don't get the hype. This book, I would probably give it an 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed it. I, you know, for the most part, didn't struggle to pick it up. I thought it gave you a lot to chew over. You know, it wasn't a book that was just like fun to read and fluffy. It really had a lot of good philosophical and sort of social questions built into it that you have to struggle with to be able to really get yourself immersed in the narrative. The writing was incredible. It's very poetic. And as I said before, I think that she does a really good job of communicating the character of Thomas Cromwell and the way that he moves through the world as this sort of slick chameleon through the writing style. But this novel got so much hype. This novel won the 2009 Booker Prize. Just a few months ago, the New York Times ranked this 3rd in its best books of the century so far list. And 4th, by the way, the book that this beat out by 1 slot was Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. And the thing about this book is that it is not gonna haunt me. Like, it's a good book. I really liked it. But the idea that someone would rank this book above Never Let Me Go kind of blew my mind. So my overall takeaway is, maybe I'm missing something. If I'm missing something, you know, let me know in the comments. But a really solid book, but probably a bit overrated. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And as always, thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video.